Harry Furness was born in Wexford, Ireland in 1854, but considered himself to be British as his father was English and his mother from Scotland, and at the time that region of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. He was educated in Dublin but had no formal art education. And following school he worked briefly for a wood engraving firm, although not as an engraver, and even contributed to Zosimus, a short-lived Irish humour magazine, while still in his teens. At the age of 19 in 1873 he left for England, and once he'd settled in lodgings in London he started work for the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News. Not long after, the publication was bought by the owners of the much bigger Illustrated London News, and for his new employers he produced illustrations of major social and sporting events, as well as attending numerous trials as a court artist. All his drawings at this time were necessarily reproduced as wood engravings, and his early experiences in the Irish Engraving Company meant he was familiar with how to work with this process and keep the engravers happy. In 1877 he married Marianne Rogers, and a couple of years later the first of 4 children was born. And by this point he was also having journalistic illustration published in the highly regarded Graphic magazine. Having become quite well established through his work to date, in 1880, when he was still only 26, he started having work published in Punch, the most popular and respected satirical magazine of the Victorian age. And he quickly became an invaluable asset to the magazine's visual content, with many appearances to his name. He didn't work exclusively for Punch, and in 1886 he published a children's book, Romps All the Year Round, which had a cover and some pages printed in chromolithographic full colour, but it was his series of comedic 2-colour spot illustrations which showed him at his gestural best. But in the following year a much more successful colour series appeared in the comic Blackstone, a humorous exploration of the baffling complexities of the British legal system, written by Arthur A. Beckett. These humorous full pages gave a much better idea of what Furness could create using colour, and it's a great pity there isn't more of this created by him during his career. He was evidently extremely prolific at this time, because also in 1887 his parody The Royal Academy, an artistic joke, was also published. This little book took cheerful potshots at the Academy and many of those who exhibited at its annual exhibition. And yet another highly popular parody, this time of Isaac Walton's 1653 book The Complete Angler, now cheekily retitled The Incomplete Angler, with a collection of very well-drawn comic monochrome pages. Again, the humour was good-natured and frequently absurd, and the collection made for an amusing and popular read. And as with his work for Punch, this book was also skillfully engraved by the magazine's engraver of choice, Joseph Swain. In the same year he also had a handful of drawings published as one of no less than 4 different illustrators chosen for the book Rhymes for the Young Folk by William Allingham. But whatever other projects he was involved with, his professional relationship with Punch continued undiminished, and he became increasingly popular with his political subjects in particular. In 1889 his collaboration with author Lewis Carroll, the book Sylvie and Bruno, was published. John Tenniel, who had been the first to illustrate Carroll's Alice books some 25 years earlier, warned Furness about the author's controlling ways and generally unlikable character. But despite his misgivings, Furness agreed to the commission. And although the pair had struggled to agree about virtually any aspect of the book, Furness's illustrations were appropriately madcap and engrossingly imaginative, and although nothing like as popular as the Alice books, it proved to be a reasonable success. In 1890, Furness returned to the world of art for his book Academy Antics, in which he once more made fun of the general pomposity and self-importance of the British art establishment at the time. In the same year the book Wanted, a King, written by Maggie Brown, was published, featuring a series of gloriously surreal and highly entertaining expressive pen drawings from Furness. This was another fantasy tale similar to Lewis Carroll's Alice books, with a young girl as the heroine and her encounters with a host of bizarre and not always well-intentioned nursery rhyme characters. It was popular enough to be reprinted several times, and later editions even featured a rare watercolour frontispiece. By this point, his success had led to the purchase of a large house for himself and his family near London's Regent's Park, and despite his considerable workload, he found time to travel regularly. In 1892, he published his book of illustrated travel anecdotes titled Flying Visits, and in the same year made his first trip to the USA, but whether this was business or pleasure isn't recorded. Despite his earlier less than happy collaboration with Lewis Carroll, he reluctantly agreed to illustrate a second book about the same characters, Sylvie and Bruno Concluded, which was just as surreal and entertaining as the first, at least in pictorial terms, and was completed and published in 1894, at which point Furness vowed never to work with the author again, and never did. 1894 was also the year that he left Punch after a falling out caused by him selling the copyright of a drawing he'd made for Punch a decade earlier for an advertising campaign by Pears Soap. Following his acrimonious departure, Furness brought out his own humorous magazine, Like a Joko, as a rival to Punch, which, naturally enough, featured his work and contributions from other pen and ink humorous contemporaries. And although it contained some impressive work, it failed to connect with the public, and only a year later ceased publication. Furness not only lost a considerable amount of money due to the failure of the project, but his reputation also suffered as a consequence. Nevertheless, he rallied with more book work, and in 1895 The Wally Pug of Wye, written by G. E. Farrow, was published. And alongside his own larger format illustrations, it featured some smaller spots and chapter headings from his daughter Dorothy. This was another narrative which owed a certain debt to Alice in Wonderland, but once more Furness's drawings were engagingly absurd and contributed greatly to the book's popular success. In 1896, Furness returned to the USA, where his work had by this point become quite well known. And although it's known he gave an interview to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the purpose of this visit isn't clear. In 1897, his book Pen and Pencil in Parliament was published, which drew in the main from the many political satires and caricatures he had created for his now defunct magazine Like a Joko. And in the same year he sailed to Australia, and his experiences, encounters and observations of the country and its population formed the basis of his book Australian Sketches Made on Tour, which was subsequently published in 1899 and enjoyed similar success to his growing line of other creative achievements. By now he was enjoying a certain celebrity status, with a strong reputation for his drawings and skills as a witty raconteur. And in 1902 he published his 2-volume illustrated autobiography, The Confessions of a Caricaturist. And another equally well-received volume of personal recollections and anecdotes, Harry Furness at Home, was published in 1904. It's by no means certain in what year he actually drew his 20 visualizations of scenes from Lewis Carroll's Alice stories, and they were never published as an illustrated book. But they were published in 1908 in 3 instalments of the Children's Encyclopedia, and revealed his innate affinity for the illustration of absurd children's fantasy. Not that any further proof of this was needed. In recognition of his status as one of the country's finest pen and ink illustrators, he was given the commission to illustrate Charles Dickens' books, and this monumental body of work was published in 1910 as an 18-volume set. The first book in the series was the collection of short stories, Sketches by Boz, which was Dickens' original pen name. And these illustrations set a very high standard which all others fell into line with. He created hundreds of illustrated dramatic and emotionally charged iconic moments from the various stories, as well as a large volume of particularly eloquent character studies of the vast collection of colourful figures who populated Dickens' text. The remarkably evocative illustrations he created for this series of books has arguably become his most significant legacy, and it was reprinted several times. In the following year, he produced a more modest single volume of William Makepeace Thackeray's work, which also featured illustrations by others, including John Leech, Joseph Kenny Meadows, and Thackeray's own earlier images. Most of his contributions took the form of highly descriptive monochrome character studies, but there were also several more scenic vignettes of scenes from the various narratives. He also created this marvellous colour frontispiece, and again I find myself wishing there were more examples. In 1912 he set sail on the Lusitania with his daughter Dorothy back to the USA, not as an illustrator but as a writer of dramas for the early silent movie productions of Thomas Edison. Furness was apparently highly enthusiastic about the filmmaking process, and he made a couple of unexceptional live-action shorts, including Peace and War, pencilings by Harry Furness, in 1917, in which he created cartoons on screen. At the end of the war, he returned to Britain and retired to the south coast town of Hastings, but he still wrote and illustrated occasional books, and in 1919 he published a collection of theatrical anecdotes and drawings titled My Bohemian Days. In 1923 he published a collection titled Some Victorian Women, and in the following year he followed this with Some Victorian Men, neither of which could be considered among his greatest achievements. And following a career of 54 years, Harry Furness died in Hastings in 1925 at the age of 71. Although his later books had only served to demonstrate that he had become somewhat of an anachronism in the post-war British cultural landscape, in his heyday he'd been one of the most significant comedic pen and ink illustrators. There's no doubt that despite his success in his lifetime, that he has become an increasingly neglected talent over the decades. But for some, including me, he was a highly influential, skillful and imaginative figure, and collecting and viewing the images I used in this video have served to remind me just how important his contribution was.